move on away from my bio. Can you go to the first slide? Yes. So I understand, first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak here today. And if I understand, I was told to speak something like 20 minutes, is that right? Because I will be walking around. And so indeed, I hope I will be as focused as I'd like to be today, because I literally just stepped off a plane from Idaho National Labs, where I did a cybersecurity training session myself, which was actually quite technical and quite detailed. So today I will zoom out onto the more strategic level, because I assume that here in the audience, few, if any, people have a technical background. Can I just ask you for a quick hand? Do we have any engineers or computer scientists here? Okay, at least a few people. Let's make a first sort of observation. When I started working on cybersecurity, I'm not a computer scientist or engineer by training. I'm a political scientist by training. I sometimes had this nagging feeling when I talk to technicians, people with a more technical background, that I can't quite understand all the details as well as I'd like to understand them. But then the longer I've been doing this, the more I understood that even computer scientists, even professors for computer science or entrepreneurs, people who really know their field very well, don't have an overview. Nobody has an overview of cybersecurity. That's a very simple statement, and anybody who claims they understand it all is lying to you. So I won't even make that statement myself. I wrote a book about it, and I can tell you that only shows you how broad and how deep that field is. So the first important thing here is if you, and it doesn't matter whether you're a government or a company or a non-state organization, an NGO, you need a team to understand cybersecurity, and you also really need more than one person. You need a good team in charge of your own cybersecurity if you want to get it right. So that's just a humble starting assumption. The debate currently on a strategic level is rather shrill, and it has been rather shrill for the past couple of years. There's a lot of talk about cyber war and the tremendous risks of a cyber Pearl Harbor that could happen anytime. What I'd like to do now is essentially move beyond this debate and break down the problem into 3 dimensions very concisely. And in contrast to this debate that focuses on war and implicitly really on violence, what we're seeing if we look at the separate dimensions here, and the dimensions are sabotage operations, espionage, or intelligence operations, as well as hacktivism and political activism online. If we look at these phenomena, and these are old phenomena, these are not new things, but if we look at them in a new technical context, what we see is less violence, not more violence. That's why the war metaphor, the war comparison is actually so misleading. I'll quickly walk through that argument with you and give you a few examples. Let's first look at sabotage, which I think wrongly occupies center stage in the debate. Sabotage is basically if you are trying to make a process less efficient, withdrawing efficiency from a process. That can be done by means of computer attack or by other means. So, for instance, let's take the Iranian nuclear enrichment program. The United States, as you already mentioned, and Israel try to make it less efficient, try to damage centrifuges, try to delay the process through computer attack. And they did it with Stuxnet, the most sophisticated computer attack ever, and the only serious cyber attack on control systems. For those of you with an engineering background, things that control things that are moving, systems that control whatever moves around, be it trains or gas, centrifuges in this case, power plants, the grid, these are control systems. They run on a very different computer, very different operating systems, very different design characteristics from other computer operating systems. This was the only attack, and this is a quite significant statement. This was the only attack, significant attack, that physically damaged the output of a control process. It required a tremendous amount of process knowledge on the part of the attackers to do that, to program that sabotage operation. So it was unique. There is no like Stuxnet operation. Anybody who uses an attack like Stuxnet doesn't know what they're talking about, because there's only one Stuxnet at this point in time. And for a number of reasons, it's unlikely that we see another Stuxnet very soon. But sabotage doesn't necessarily have to attack and target control systems. Perhaps the most significant from a business point of view, from an economic perspective, the most significant sabotage operation was the attack on Saudi Aramco that deleted and damaged so many computers, 30,000 of the company's workstations, 75% of all computers in 2012. Now, less violent. Why? Because really it was a non-violent attack. Nobody was injured. Not even a physical process was affected. The attackers tried to sabotage the control systems that control the oil production, but they didn't manage to do so. Instead, we have data loss. Hugely problematic. I mean, it was a near catastrophe for the company. So I'm not saying this is less efficient or less dramatic or less problematic, really, if you limit yourself to destroying data. But it is not a violent type of activity, which has political consequences. But let's not focus too much on sabotage, because if we would walk through all the major cases of computer attack that could be classified as sabotage, we would be looking at something between 5 and 10 cases. Depends on what you take into that set. You could expand it a little bit. But the major problem in terms of numbers, in terms of quantity, is espionage, intelligence operations, stealing information, or shall we say, procuring information in two different contexts, in a commercial context, economic espionage, and in a political context, as right now, because of the Snowden leaks, is in the center of our attention. And by and large, if you look at Asia here, you get an interesting picture, because in Asia, in contrast to Europe or in North America, we have a mix of democracies and non-democratic countries. And if you look at economic espionage especially, slightly different. So the rules in Asia are a little more diverse than they are in the West, because the NSA, GCHQ, other intelligence organizations do not engage in economic espionage. That is, as we all know, not necessarily true in some Asian countries. So if we look again at the numbers, we see a massive drainage of intellectual property from highly creative and innovative economies to other economies, most importantly China. By the way, let me just mention this here in brackets, because I think it's important to say this in a conference that is focusing on Asia. The attribution problem is maybe known to many of you here in the room. The attribution problem is finding out who did it, who attacked you. In the case of Stuxnet, who did it? We know because the US and Israel admitted it, that they did it. In the case of Shamoon, Saudi Aramco, we don't really know that it was Iran. That's an assumption. We don't have very good evidence to back this assumption up in the public domain. In the case of this particular attack that I'm hinting at here with that picture, the assumption is that a specific PLA unit, Unit 61398, engaged in a large number of commercial espionage attacks against American and other targets. But again, it's very hard to pinpoint specific perpetrators. Now, you will read in the media you will sometimes hear from experts that this is not the case, that it is actually possible to pinpoint attackers very specifically. But if you focus on the available evidence and you drill down and you ask questions in the way an intelligence analyst would have to ask questions if they prepare a report for the Prime Minister, say, then we have to face an unpleasant truth, and that is that we oftentimes cannot clearly attribute the specific attacks. And this includes this one by that specific PLA unit. It's also an assumption at this point in time. So it's very important to recognize the attribution problem in its shades of gray, because sometimes it may actually play in your favor. It depends on who you are, of course, but it can be. It's a problem if you don't know who is attacking you, but anybody who is engaging in that kind of activity, and after all, many countries are doing that, also appreciate the attribution problem from the other side, if you see what I mean. Let me just, in the context of espionage, very briefly, and I think I'm almost beginning to run out of time already, very briefly mention a point that you may not have considered. Let's assume the position of those who are exfiltrating information from companies for a moment. Say, Chinese entities hacking into Western companies. Now, if your goal is to replicate a production process, to essentially be able to produce a product, a complex product, and this is obviously one of the most complex engineering products that came to mind when I researched the book, a turbine, a Rolls-Royce turbine. The question really is, where does the knowledge reside that you are trying to exfiltrate? Does it reside on hard drives and in documents, the production knowledge? Or, and for those of you with an MBA background, for those of you who did some management theory or management studies, you will probably know that no, knowledge actually resides within processes itself, within people, within teams. So you can't easily replicate knowledge if your best people leave you. Suppose the entire team that is building the blades for Rolls-Royce would resign en masse or would be killed in a plane crash or something like that, the entire team. Then it would be extraordinarily difficult for the company to replicate that knowledge. It is not captured explicitly on paper necessarily. Well, sometimes that's different if you have a negotiation strategy, for instance, that may be clearly in one document. But in terms of complex production processes, the knowledge is not clearly defined and explicitly captured somewhere. So the point I'm trying to make here is it is actually quite complicated for those who are engaging in economic espionage on a major scale, first to replicate complex processes, but also to become innovative on their own terms. If you're constantly stealing from others, it's probably more difficult to become innovative. This is a picture of Palo Alto in California, just to illustrate the point. You can't steal Palo Alto that easily. It's a complex ecosystem of companies. I'm not saying the message I'm trying to send here is not that espionage is not a major problem for the targets, for the victims. It certainly is. But what I'm trying to say is that from the point of the attacker, from the point of the thief, if you like, it's also a problem to deal. It's more complex than meets the eye to deal with this information that you're able to exfiltrate. I will not go into more detail on this, and just close by briefly looking at the third major challenge. Again, in Asia, the picture is more diverse than in Europe. When it comes to activism, online mobilizing political activism, political resistance online. This is not strictly speaking cybersecurity, the use of code to attack others, but it's more the use of the internet in a more chaotic way sometimes. Now, the interesting theme here is counter-subversion. I'll make it short. Why? Because Europe, Western democracies are not really in the business of counter-subversion, of suppressing political dissent. After all, democracies don't do that kind of thing. I'm sure in India a similar picture would emerge. But other countries in Asia, let's say Russia, if you count that as an Asian country, or China, they are in the business of suppressing political dissent on a major scale. And this, I think, is one of the major challenges in those societies, one I'm personally quite concerned about, because it can probably create more instability, which will affect us, economically speaking, on the long term. This is just a brief thought to end on. I will skip this slide because I think I'm running out of time. And if you're interested in going into more depth, I have a book out. It was just published a few weeks ago here in the United Kingdom, and will be published in the United States in the fall. And I'm going into a great level of more depth there. Now, how should we do the? We didn't talk about is the Q&A. Is there a Q&A, or should we move on to the next presentation right away?
You can carry on. We'll do Q&A at the end after both the presentations.
After both presentations? Excellent. Thank you.